In the grand narratives of human history, greatness is often measured in terms of power, conquest, or lasting monuments. Empires rise, leaders command armies, and their names are etched into the fabric of civilization through visible dominance. But this story begins in a way that defies all of those expectations. It is not a story about kings or generals, not about wealth or influence. It is about 12 ordinary men, individuals with no political authority, no military backing, and no societal prestige. By every conventional standard, they were insignificant, and yet their choices would echo across centuries in ways no empire ever could. What makes their story remarkable is not how they lived in comfort or rose to power, but how they responded when everything collapsed. They were not born into greatness, nor were they destined for recognition. They were fishermen, tax collectors, and common laborers, people who, under normal circumstances, would have faded into anonymity. And yet, when faced with a defining moment, they made a decision so radical that it continues to challenge human understanding. They chose not the path of survival, but the path that would almost certainly lead to their deaths. If you find yourself drawn to stories that challenge assumptions, that explore the limits of belief, and that ask uncomfortable but necessary questions about truth and conviction, this is the kind of narrative worth following closely. Consider subscribing and staying connected, because what unfolds here is not just history, it is a confrontation with the deepest layers of human choice and meaning. At the center of this story lies a profound paradox. Human instinct, refined over millennia, is oriented toward survival. When danger appears, we retreat. When threatened, we protect ourselves. This is not weakness, it is biology. And yet, these 12 men moved in the opposite direction. They did not choose the easier life available to them. They did not disappear back into obscurity, blending into the safety of the crowd. Instead, they chose to hold on to something intangible, something invisible, something that could not be proven in the way material realities can be proven, and they valued it more than their own lives. This is where the tension sharpens. People may endure hardship for something tangible, wealth, legacy, or even ideological victory. But to willingly face suffering and death for something unseen raises a far more unsettling question. What kind of conviction must exist within a person for them to prioritize an invisible truth over visible survival? What internal transformation must occur for fear, one of the most powerful forces in human behavior, to lose its controlling grip? And so the central question emerges naturally, almost unavoidably. What could possibly compel them to make such a choice? Not one or two individuals, but nearly all of them, arriving at the same conclusion independently. This is not a question that can be dismissed lightly, because it does not merely concern the past. It challenges the very framework through which we understand belief, truth, and human motivation. To understand their decision, we must first return to the moment when everything fell apart. The man they had followed, the one who had given their lives direction and meaning, was executed publicly. The crucifixion was not just a death, it was a statement. It was meant to erase hope, to silence movements, and to demonstrate the absolute authority of power. For these 12 men, it marked the apparent end of everything they had believed in. The future they had imagined vanished in a single brutal event. Hope did not fade gradually, it collapsed instantly. What had once seemed certain now appeared impossible. The one they trusted was gone, and with him, the structure of their purpose. In that moment, there was no clarity, no reassurance, only confusion and loss. It is important to recognize that their initial response was not courage, but fear. Deep, visceral fear. They went into hiding. Doors were closed. Conversations became whispers. Every sound carried the possibility of danger. This was not abstract anxiety. It was immediate and tangible. They knew that association alone could mark them as targets. The same forces that had executed their teacher could easily turn their attention toward his followers. To be identified was to risk everything. This psychological state is crucial to understanding the authenticity of what follows. These were not fearless individuals charging ahead without hesitation. They were afraid, acutely aware of the consequences, fully conscious of the risks. They experienced the same instinctive drive for self-preservation that defines all human beings. And yet, within that fear, something began to shift. Because in that moment of crisis, a choice emerged with stark clarity. It was not hidden or ambiguous. They could walk away. They could return to their former lives, resume their trades, and disappear into the anonymity of ordinary existence. No one was forcing them to continue. There was no external pressure compelling them forward. Choosing safety would have been entirely reasonable, expected even. But the alternative path stood in direct opposition. To continue speaking, to continue sharing what they believed, meant stepping into danger knowingly. It meant accepting that suffering was not a possibility, but a probability. It meant understanding that each day could be their last. What makes this moment so significant is that it strips away all illusions of coercion or misunderstanding. Their decision was not made in ignorance. It was made in full awareness of the cost. They knew what lay ahead, and still, they did not turn back. This is the turning point, the fracture line where ordinary human behavior ends and something far more complex begins. Fear was still present, but it was no longer decisive. Survival was still an option, but it was no longer the highest priority. Something deeper had taken root within them, something that redefined how they evaluated reality itself. And that is where the real mystery begins. What happened next cannot be explained as a gradual emotional recovery or a simple return to optimism. The shift that took place within these men was not superficial, nor was it temporary. It was not the kind of belief that fluctuates with circumstances or depends on external validation. Something far more radical occurred, a transformation that moved their faith from the realm of emotion into the realm of unshakable conviction. This was the turning point of the inner life. What they once held as hope, as expectation, or even as admiration for a teacher, now crystallized into certainty. Emotional belief can inspire, but it is also fragile. It rises and falls with circumstances, and under pressure, it often collapses. What replaced it in these men was fundamentally different. It was not based on wishful thinking or collective enthusiasm. It became, in their own understanding, a recognition of truth, something they no longer felt free to reinterpret or abandon. This distinction is critical. Emotional belief asks, "What do I feel to be true?" Conviction asks, "What do I know to be true, regardless of how I feel?" And once a belief crosses that threshold, it changes the entire structure of decision-making. Fear may still exist, but it no longer has ultimate authority. Survival remains valuable, but it is no longer absolute. The hierarchy has been rearranged. What gave rise to such a transformation? The text strongly implies that their conviction was not inherited or second-hand. It was not built on rumors, nor sustained by social pressure. It was deeply personal, rooted in what they believed they had directly experienced. This is what distinguishes their new state of belief from mere ideology. Ideologies can be adopted, modified, or discarded, but personal experience, especially one perceived as undeniable, resists such flexibility. Their faith became individualized. Each of them, in his own way, carried not just a shared message, but a personal certainty. This matters because collective belief can sometimes be explained through group dynamics, conformity, influence, or shared emotion. But individualized conviction, especially when maintained under extreme pressure, points to something more resilient. It suggests that what they believed was not dependent on each other's reinforcement. Even in isolation, the belief would remain intact. And with that came an important consequence. There was no return. Once a person becomes convinced at that level, once they interpret their experience as truth rather than possibility, the option of going back is not merely difficult. It becomes psychologically and existentially incoherent. To deny that conviction would not simply be to change one's mind, it would be to deny one's own understanding of reality. This is why the earlier choice between safety and danger takes on a new dimension. It was no longer a simple calculation between living quietly or risking death. For them, abandoning their message would have required something deeper than silence. It would have required a form of self-betrayal. And for a person who believes they have encountered truth directly, that kind of betrayal can feel more intolerable than physical death. This helps explain why fear, though still present, no longer dictated their actions. Fear can control behavior when survival is the highest value. But when truth, perceived as absolute, takes that position, fear is recontextualized. It becomes a factor, not a master. They did not become fearless, rather they became anchored in something that outweighed fear. From this internal transformation, their external actions begin to make sense, and what follows is perhaps just as striking as the change within them. Instead of consolidating, instead of forming a unified and protected movement, they dispersed. This dispersion is one of the most overlooked yet revealing aspects of the narrative. In most historical movements, especially those facing opposition, survival depends on cohesion. Groups stay together to protect one another, to strategize, to build strength in numbers. Leadership structures are formed, plans are coordinated, and resources are pooled. But that is not what happened here. They did not remain in a single location. They did not construct a centralized system. They did not move as a unified body to maximize influence or minimize risk. Instead, they separated, geographically, culturally, and socially. Each went in a different direction, into unfamiliar territories, often alone or with minimal support. This lack of collective strategy is significant. It suggests that their mission was not driven by organizational logic or tactical planning. There is no indication of a coordinated campaign designed to achieve measurable outcomes. No evidence of a structured expansion plan. What we see instead is a series of individual trajectories, each shaped by personal conviction rather than centralized command. Equally important is what they did not have. They had no military protection, no political alliances, no institutional backing. They did not carry with them the tools that typically enable movements to survive in hostile environments. In fact, from a purely strategic standpoint, their approach appears almost irrational. They entered regions where they were outsiders, where their message was unfamiliar or unwelcome, and where the risks were immediate and severe. This raises an important analytical point. If their actions were not guided by strategy, power, or external compulsion, then they must have been driven by something internal, something that made the act of going itself necessary, regardless of outcome. Their movement outward was not a calculated expansion, it was an expression of conviction. And this is where the meaning of their dispersion becomes clear. It was not fragmentation, it was multiplication. Each individual carried the message independently, not because it was efficient, but because it was unavoidable. Their belief did not allow them to remain passive, nor did it require the presence of others to sustain it. It propelled them outward into uncertainty without guarantees. This also reinforces the voluntary nature of their actions. There was no coercion binding them together, no system enforcing participation. Each decision to leave, to speak, to continue was made individually, and that individuality strengthens the overall pattern. Because when multiple individuals, acting independently, arrive at the same costly decision, the explanation becomes more complex. It cannot be reduced to group pressure or manipulation. In the end, what emerges from this phase of the story is a portrait of radical autonomy combined with unwavering conviction. They were not following orders in the conventional sense. They were acting out of an internal necessity, one that overrode fear, dismissed safety, and rendered retreat impossible. and once that kind of movement begins, its trajectory becomes difficult to contain. Once that movement outward began, driven not by strategy but by conviction, it inevitably converged with resistance. The world they entered was not neutral. It was structured by power, tradition, and competing belief systems that did not easily accommodate disruptive claims. And so, what followed was not a gradual fading of their mission, but a sharpening of its cost. The abstract possibility of death, once anticipated, now became concrete. It took form in specific places, under specific Ishkan authorities, and ultimately in the lives of each individual. What emerges at this stage is not a single narrative, but a sequence, a pattern of endings that, taken together, form a coherent structure. These deaths were not identical. They varied in method, intensity, and context. Yet beneath that variation lies a striking consistency. None of them chose to retreat when confronted with the final consequence. To better understand this, it is useful to examine these lives not merely as isolated events, but as grouped expressions of the same underlying conviction. The first group can be described as those whose deaths carry strong symbolic weight, figures whose personal journeys amplify the meaning of their final moments. Peter stands at the forefront of this category. His story is marked by contradiction. He was not unwavering from the beginning. In fact, he is remembered for a moment of profound failure, when fear led him to deny the very teacher he once vowed to follow. That failure is essential because it establishes a baseline of human weakness. And yet, his later actions redefine him entirely. When he was eventually arrested and sentenced to crucifixion, he did not resist the outcome. Instead, he made a request that has echoed through history, to be crucified upside down, declaring himself unworthy to die in the same manner as his teacher. This is not merely an act of humility, it is a final statement of identity. His death becomes a symbol, not of perfection, but of restoration, a movement from fear to fidelity, from denial to unwavering loyalty. Paul represents a different kind of transformation, equally profound but structurally opposite. He did not begin as a follower at all. He began as an Verotuk, as someone actively opposing and persecuting those within the movement. His conviction, initially, was directed against them, but something altered his trajectory completely. He did not merely change his opinion, he reversed his entire orientation, from persecutor to proponent, from suppressor to messenger. His influence extended not only through speech but through writing, shaping thought across distances he could never physically reach. And yet, this visibility made him a target. As a Roman citizen, his execution differed in form. He was beheaded rather than crucified, but the implication remains the same. His death signifies total transformation, a life that crossed from one extreme to another and remained consistent to the end. The second group is defined not by symbolic reversal, but by endurance, those whose deaths were prolonged, whose suffering extended over time. Andrew, the brother of Peter, is central here. According to tradition, he was crucified on an X-shaped cross. Unlike immediate executions, this form of death was slow, stretching across days. What is remarkable is not only the duration, but his response within it. Rather than retreating into silence, he continued to speak, to teach, to encourage those who witnessed his suffering. Pain, in most human contexts, narrows focus inward, it isolates. But in his case, it became an extension of his mission. His final moments were not a withdrawal from his message, but an intensification of it. Bartholomew's story, though preserved with varying details, consistently emphasizes brutality. The specifics differ across accounts, but all converge on the same point. His death involved extreme physical torment. Here, the narrative reaches a different kind of threshold. It is one thing to accept death as a concept. It is another to endure escalating pain without recanting. His case represents the intersection of physical sema and internal resolve. The body reaches its limits, yet the conviction remains intact. This transforms suffering from mere gutna into testimony. The third group consists of those whose deaths were comparatively swift, yet no less significant. James the Greater was executed by the sword, a decisive, immediate act. There is no prolonged narrative of suffering, no extended dialogue, and yet his death carries historical weight as one of the earliest among them. It marks a transition point, from anticipated khata to realized consequence. What had been a sampavna became a pattern. Thomas extends the geographical scope of the narrative. His journey took him far beyond familiar territories, reaching as far as India. This detail is not incidental. It underscores the extent of their dispersion, the willingness to cross not only physical distance but cultural boundaries. His death, by spear, is abrupt, but it occurs in a context that highlights the global trajectory of their mission. His life embodies movement to the very edges of the known world, and his death seals that vistar. Then there is a group for whom historical detail is less precise, yet whose pattern remains consistent. Philip, Simon, and Jude Thaddeus fall into this category. The records surrounding them are fragmented, sometimes conflicting. But this ambiguity does not weaken the overall structure. In fact, it reinforces a key point. The significance of their stories does not depend on the exact method of death, but on the continuity of their choice. Across differing accounts, one element remains thabit: they did not abandon their message. Even in the absence of detailed narratives, the consistency of outcome speaks with clarity. Another category emerges in contrast: those whose deaths occurred in relative silence, without spectacle or prolonged attention. Matthew is remembered as being killed while at prayer. There is a quietness to this image, a lack of resistance or drama. It is not a public display, but a private conclusion. Similarly, James the Less is said to have been thrown from a height and then beaten to death when the fall did not immediately end his life. There is a harshness here, but also an absence of narrative embellishment. These are not deaths designed to inspire awe through their extremity. They are stark, almost unadorned, and yet they carry the same defining feature: no retraction, no reversal. Finally, there is the exception: John. Unlike the others, he was not executed. Instead, he endured a different form of suffering: exile. He was removed from society, isolated on an island, cut off from the communities that had once surrounded him. This form of punishment operates differently. It does not end life. It prolongs it under conditions of separation and mahdudit. And yet, even in that isolation, his role did not cease. He became a witness in another sense, not through death but through continuation. His writings, particularly those associated with apocalyptic vision, extend the narrative beyond physical presence. He stands as a living testimony, a reminder that endurance can take multiple forms. When these accounts are viewed collectively, a pattern becomes unmistakable. The differences are real: different methods, different shed, different contexts, but the underlying structure is unified. Each life moves toward a point where retreat is possible, where silence could preserve existence, and in each case, that option is not taken. This is where the analytical weight of the narrative accumulates. It is not any single death that demands explanation, but the convergence of all of them. Variation in detail eliminates the possibility of a single scripted outcome. Consistency in decision eliminates the likelihood of coincidence. What remains is a phenomenon that resists simple reduction. And it is precisely at this convergence, where individuality and uniformity intersect, that the story deepens from history into something far more demanding to interpret. When these individual trajectories are placed side by side, the narrative begins to shift from description into interpretation. What initially appears as a series of tragic endings starts to reveal a deeper philosophical tension, one that cuts directly into the structure of human behavior itself. At its core lies a fundamental conflict: the instinct to survive versus the decision to remain faithful to a conviction, even at the cost of life. From a biological and psychological standpoint, survival is not merely a preference, it is the default orientation of human existence. Every reflex, every adaptive behavior, every evolutionary advantage is aligned toward preserving life. When threatened, the body reacts automatically: fight, flight, or freeze. This is not a moral choice. It is an embedded system. And yet, in the cases we have examined, this system appears to be overridden, not absent, not ignored, but subordinated. This distinction is essential. These individuals did not lack awareness of danger. They did not misunderstand the consequences of their actions. On the contrary, the evidence suggests heightened awareness. They knew what awaited them, and still, they moved forward. This introduces a philosophical problem. Under what conditions does a human being choose something other than survival as the highest good? The answer cannot be reduced to recklessness or irrationality. To dismiss their actions as impulsive would require evidence of spontaneity or emotional instability, yet the pattern shows the opposite. Their decisions were sustained over time, repeated across different contexts, and maintained under escalating pressure. Impulses fade quickly, convictions endure. What we observe here is not a momentary surge of emotion, but a stable reordering of priorities. Nor can their actions be adequately explained through coercion. There is no indication of an external force compelling them to continue, no centralized authority enforcing compliance, no system of reward that would justify the risk. In fact, all available incentives pointed in the opposite direction. Silence would have ensured safety. Retraction would have restored normalcy. The absence of coercion strengthens the voluntary nature of their choices and, by extension, intensifies the need for explanation. This leads directly into a more structured line of reasoning, one that has been debated across centuries. While it is possible for a person to suffer or even die for something that is not true, such cases often involve misinformation, manipulation, or limited knowledge. However, the situation becomes more complex when multiple individuals, independently and consistently, accept death without recanting, especially when they are in positions where denial would immediately save them. Here, the argument is not that their willingness to die proves the truth of their belief in an absolute sense. Rather, it raises a critical epistemological question: what did they believe they knew? If their conviction was based on something they had directly experienced, something they interpreted as undeniable, then their refusal to retract becomes more intelligible. People may defend ideas passionately, but they rarely choose death for something they internally recognize as false. The cumulative effect of this pattern is not a forced conclusion, but an open challenge. It does not demand agreement, but it resists easy dismissal. It invites analysis, not blind acceptance, and it leaves the reader with a question that cannot be answered casually. What kind of certainty produces this kind of consistency? From this philosophical tension emerges an even more striking paradox, one that transforms the meaning of their deaths entirely. In most contexts, death signifies termination. It is the end of influence, the cessation of voice, the final boundary beyond which action is no longer possible. Power structures throughout history have relied on this assumption. Eliminate the individual, and the movement dissolves. Silence the speaker, and the message disappears. But in this case, the opposite seems to occur. Their deaths do not extinguish the message, they intensify it. What was once spoken in localized settings begins to spread beyond them. The very act intended to suppress their influence becomes the mechanism through which it expands. This is not intuitive. It contradicts the expected outcome, and yet it is precisely this contradiction that gives the narrative its enduring force. Part of the explanation lies in the absence of conventional Adawat power. They did not possess armies to enforce belief. They did not establish political systems to mandate adherence. There was no institutional framework compelling others to accept their claims. Without these Adawat, the spread of their message depended entirely on a different set of awamil. ones that are less visible but potentially more resilient. Their influence propagated through two primary channels: the way they lived and the way they died. The way they lived provided continuity. It demonstrated consistency between belief and action. Their message was not abstract theory, it was embodied in behavior. This alignment between conviction and conduct created a form of credibility that does not rely on authority. It does not demand acceptance, but it invites trust. The way they died, however, introduced a different dimension. Death, when approached with resistance, often communicates fear or defeat. But death, when faced with composure, without retraction, without compromise, communicates something else entirely. It signals that the individual values something beyond life itself, and that signal is difficult to ignore. It is important to clarify that death, in isolation, is not persuasive. Many have died for many causes, some noble, others misguided. What distinguishes this case is not the mere fact of death, but the pattern surrounding it, the consistency, the voluntariness, the absence of coercion, and the alignment with prior conviction. When these elements converge, the meaning of death shifts. It becomes not just an end, but a form of communication. In this sense, their deaths function as a kind of message, one that operates beyond words. It does not argue, it demonstrates. It does not compel, it confronts. It forces observers, both then and now, to grapple with the implications of such unwavering commitment. And perhaps this is why the narrative has endured. Not because it provides easy answers, but because it refuses to let the question disappear. What then remains after such lives have ended? If we evaluate their legacy through conventional historical metrics, the answer would seem almost dismissive. They did not leave behind monuments carved in stone. They did not establish political dynasties or accumulate wealth that could be passed from generation to generation. There was no empire bearing their names, no institutional power structure that ensured their dominance over others. By the standards typically used to measure historical significance, territory, al-quwa, economic control, they left almost nothing. And yet, this absence is precisely where the paradox deepens. Because while they left behind no material inheritance, what they transmitted proved far more enduring than physical structures. Material legacies decay, empires fracture, wealth dissipates. But what persisted in their case was something less tangible and yet more resilient, a form of belief that moved across time, across geography, and across cultures without relying on coercion or centralized authority. This is the essence of their true legacy. It is not located in objects, but in continuity. Their message did not remain confined to the regions where they lived and died. It moved outward, carried not by force but by transmission, person to person, generation to generation. It adapted to languages, entered different cultural frameworks, and survived contexts vastly removed from its origin. This kind of endurance cannot be explained through traditional mechanisms of power. It suggests that the force sustaining it operates on a different level, one tied not to external cetera, but to internal conviction. The global scope of this influence is not merely a matter of numerical expansion. It reflects a deeper phenomenon, the capacity of an idea to remain meaningful under radically different conditions. Historical contexts change, social structures evolve, intellectual paradigms shift, and yet the core narrative associated with these individuals continues to be engaged, questioned, and, for many, embraced. This persistence indicates that their legacy is not static, it is dynamically interpreted across time. At this point, the narrative turns outward, away from historical reconstruction and toward existential reflection. Because the story, when followed to its logical conclusion, does not remain safely contained in the past. It begins to press upon the present, demanding a response that is not merely analytical, but personal. The question that emerges is not rhetorical, nor is it easily dismissed. Would you, under similar conditions, make the same choice? This is not a question about abstract admiration. It is not asking whether their actions were impressive or historically significant. It is asking something far more direct. What is the hierarchy of values within your own life? When belief is placed under pressure, when it carries a cost, what determines whether it is maintained or abandoned? For most people, belief operates comfortably within low-risk environments. It aligns with social norms, coexists with personal security, and does not demand significant sacrifice. In such conditions, belief can appear strong without ever being tested. But the narrative we have explored operates under entirely different conditions. It places belief in direct conflict with survival, forcing a reordering of priorities that few are ever required to confront. This is why the story retains its actualness, its enduring relevance. It is not confined to a distant historical moment. The external circumstances may differ, but the underlying structure of the question remains present. In every era, individuals encounter situations where truth, integrity, or conviction comes at a cost. The scale may vary: social pressure, professional consequences, personal loss, but the dynamic is the same. Something is at stake, and a decision must be made. What this narrative does is remove ambiguity. It presents a scenario in its most extreme form, where the cost is unmistakable and the choice is clear. And in doing so, it acts as a mirror, not one that reflects historical figures, but one that reflects the reader. It forces an examination, not of what others have done, but of what one would do. This is where the analytical dimension of the story reaches its limit. Beyond this point, interpretation gives way to introspection, because no amount of historical analysis can substitute for the personal question it raises. Each individual must answer it within the framework of their own values, their own experiences, and their own understanding of truth. And so we arrive at the conclusion, not as a closing statement, but as a consolidation of everything that has been examined. These individuals did not die as victims of random obstoятельства, nor as casualties of failed ambition. Their deaths were not the result of collapse, but of continuity. They did not abandon their message at the point of greatest pressure, they maintained it. In that sense, their deaths do not signify defeat. They represent the final extension of a commitment that had already been established long before the moment of execution. This reframes the meaning of faith itself. If faith were merely an emotional state, it would dissolve under pressure. If it were merely a social construct, it would adapt to preserve comfort. But in this case, faith appears as something more durable, something that functions as a sustained choice rather than a temporary condition. It is not defined by ease, but by persistence, not by agreement with circumstances, but by consistency across them. And that leads directly to the final challenge, one that cannot be outsourced, avoided, or answered on behalf of someone else. When your own beliefs, whatever they may be, are tested, what will determine your response? Will they adjust to protect you, or will you remain aligned with them even when the cost becomes real? This is not a question that demands immediate resolution, but it is one that, once encountered, is difficult to ignore, because embedded within it is a deeper inquiry, not only about belief, but about identity itself. What do you ultimately stand on? And when that foundation is shaken, will it hold?